Good evening, folks. And tonight we're going to talk about the history of the swastika. Now, believe it or not, the swastika is actually older than its actual age, than actually when it was perceived to be used. It actually goes back to ancient Greek and beyond. The Greeks used it, the Chinese used it, among many other cultures. Plenty of cultures use the swastika, but not for hate reasons, but for good reasons. Now, I know this is going to get a lot of backlash, but you should look this up. You should actually type in swastika and see what it was actually used for back in those days before 1940s and 30s, before Hitler adopted it. It was actually quite interesting. I actually had to dig a little digging myself, and I actually found a lot of interesting things. The Hindus used it. The Judists used it. The Buddhists used it. The Buddhists used it. Buddhists used it, and Hindus used it. Hinduism, Buddhism, among many other religions, used the swastika as their thing back in the good old days. Even the Hebrews used it. Now, I don't know if they still do or not, but that's still up for debate to this day. But in the United States, it's viewed as a symbol of hate. Now, we might do a thing about the Confederate battle flag, which is not the stars and bars. That is, the Confederate flag is not the X where you see the red flag with the blue with the whole entire red. The red flag with the blue X on it with stars going through. That is not the Confederate flag. That is the Confederate battle flag. Now, that same goes with the stars and bars. That is not the stars and bars flag either. The stars and bars and the Confederate flag are the same. The stars and bars is technically the Confederate flag. Now, the Confederate battle flag was used on the battlefield to fight one another. That will come to use for another day. And it'll be quite an interesting conversation that we have at another time. Now, and we'll also talk about Dixie, the song, as well, with that time frame. Now, Hitler used the swastika because he wanted to use that swastika due to the fact it was that supposedly Germans used it back during the time frame. He was into history himself, but he wanted to use that during the time frame himself, because it symbolized lots of Germans. But during the beer spoof, we'll talk about that another time. But actually, we'll kind of talk about that, and that kind of spins it to where we are. The beer push was one of those things that were very viewable, obviously, and that's where he kind of adopted the swastika then and there, because he kind of put it on there. It wasn't very well thought of at that time, but he kind of thought of it that way. He put it on some people in 1923, and then he went over there and started giving. Over 2,000 people marched on the street and confronted, and this was in Munich, Germany, and confronted over 130 police officers. Multiple were injured. Several were injured, but then they came into a gunfight with Germans. Hitler was dislocated his arm after his counterpart was shot, and Hermann Göring was shot. He was injured. He dislocated his arm. They tried to shoot at him continuously, but somehow he managed to escape. So lucky he managed to do that. I still wonder to this day if history would have been redirected. We're going to do a little history about that. But we're going to do the what ifs. We're going to do a what ifs type of thing of multiple parts here. I'm currently doing a little thing about that right now, but it's going to take a little time for me to get all that together with the battles and everything. And that's mostly to do with the Franco-Prussian War, of how things would have turned out if things would have been differently than what they were. But as I was saying was, the way you view this is like, then when Hitler adopted it, that's when it pretty much went south. Because Hitler spent 9 months in a German jail. He spent 9 months in jail, then he pretty much came out. This was back in 1924. He didn't raise to power till he decided to wait till it was legal again. I guess he rose to power back in 1933. And that's when he finally took command of the power. So, voila. Hitler in command showed that he was absolutely monstrous and really showed his power. And lo and behold, Hitler took over, and that's when he adopted the swastika and took down all those other flags and put up the swastika flag, the Weimar Republic flag, which was kind of like the flag that you see today over in Germany. If any of you have ever been to Germany, comment down below the flag that you see. That's the Weimar Republic flag that they used back then, versus the flag that they used during the time, which had a swastika on it. It was red with white center and a swastika around the whiteness that was in black. That was the color that they used for the Germans back in those days. Plus his brown uniform with the swastika on the sleeves. That was how they determined those uniforms. So, back on to most of the main subject here, about how the swastika got its hateful use. Well, we all would have thought, okay, the Nazis are done. Okay, Nazis, Hitler's dead, Nazis are dead. Well, apparently, some Americans over here endured Hitler. They loved Hitler. So they created a group called the Neo-Nazis. So, the group continued. And here in the United States, we consider that a hate symbol. So, you may not even know that, if you're a Buddhist or anything of that nature in Greek or of some kind that has to do with that, we may view you as a hatred, as a hate of cult. Because the Nazis were a cult back then. They created a cult for World War II. But we didn't view it as that. I mean, it's quite interesting. And I know it seems kind of odd to say that, but it is true. You should look it up. But if you like this video, hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. With that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.